I'd like to start by thanking all the people that made it possible for this thing to happen and for me to be here. I know that these things are just don't happen. A lot of people do a lot of hard work. How about an extra hand for the committee, huh? My name is Bob Smith, and I'm an enthusiastic member of Al-Anon. I think I got here like most Al-Anons. I loved an alcoholic. My wife, Betty, who passed away almost 4 years ago, was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, 19 years sober in the program when she died. So thank goodness that you long-timers kept it green and viable for us when we needed it so badly. You know, it's not what we add to the templed past, but how well we keep it green. I've been a member of Al-Anon for 23 years, and I think there's several things I must do to be an Al-Anon. I don't think you're automatically an Al-Anon if you're associated with somebody in AA. I think it requires some extra work on your part. I think I must live the steps. I think I must abide by the traditions. I think I must attend the meetings regularly, and I think I need to have a sponsor. And I do these things. Now, my first sponsor was a woman. I know we don't encourage people of the opposite sex to be a sponsor, but when I came into the program, the only guy around was a man about the age of my son, and I didn't think we had too much going. So I asked this lady to be my sponsor, and she's been my sponsor and still my service sponsor. And like I say, we don't encourage sponsors of the opposite sex, but I think you can tell by looking at me that this is not a very serious problem. Hey, now don't misunderstand me. I love to see you beautiful ladies. I just can't remember why. Anyway, I'd like to tell you that I volunteered for service. You know, that's part of our triangle, either program. But my sponsor actually goaded me into it. And I've been the GR and I've been the DR, and I served 3 years with the West Texas Assembly. And several years ago, I got a call from our central office in New York City then, asking me if I'd consider myself to be a candidate for trustee at large of all of Al-Anon. And I seemed to have the educational qualifications for which they searched and business experience, and I prayed about it and talked to my group. I called them back and said, yeah, be glad to put my name down as a candidate for trustee at large for all of Al-Anon. And guess what? I didn't get it. Oh, don't we hate rejection? And of course, my first thought was, if they didn't want me, why did they bother me? But then my program came to my rescue like it always will and said, hey, whoever got that job was the one that was perfect for the job at the time, met their needs at the time, was capable of doing a better job than you. And maybe, just maybe, our Heavenly Father has something else He wants me to do. And I'm totally free of that. And that's one of the things, one of the benefits that I get from my program. I'm somewhat of an anachronism, though. I'm the only person still living that was present when the two co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous met for the very first time, Mother's Day, Akron, Ohio, 1935. My dad's Dr. Bob and my mom's Ann, and I rode out with my parents to meet with Bill for the very first time. And now, see, my beloved sister died 6 weeks ago, and so I'm the only one left now. And what people seem to want to hear from me was what was like, and so forth. And so what I want to do today, I want to talk to you about starting from nothing, because these programs start from nothing. And maybe there was somebody here whose life right now is starting from nothing. I'm going to talk to you about miracles, because I consider these programs to be absolute miracles, nudging miracles that our Heavenly Father has guided us so that we didn't destroy. And can you imagine what it looks like in my eyes today, starting with two guys that couldn't raise $50 between them, to what it is all over the world? So I want to talk to you about miracles, because I feel that perhaps someone in this room is in bad need of a miracle right now. And I want to talk to you about recovery. How did they do it? What worked and what didn't work? I'm going to more or less skip what it used to be like. I'm going on the basic principle that everyone here already knows how to be miserable. Okay, we'll hit that one lightly then. It was in the middle of the last Great Depression, and we lived in a one industry town, Akron, Ohio. They made tires there. Goodyear, Goodrich, General, Firestone, Cyberling, Miller, all the rubber factories were there. Well, when the Depression hit, people stopped buying automobiles, and they sure didn't need tires, and the rubber shops went down to 2 days a week. And there were strong men on the street corners selling apples for 5 cents apiece to try and support their families. That's how tough the times were. But again, I think perhaps it was providentially arranged because people had more time for each other, more time to visit, more time to talk to each other. They weren't as hurried and harried as perhaps we are now. And I think this was absolutely essential to get the feed in from everybody that made these programs the way they are now. I want to tell you about my dad. I think you'd have loved the guy. You know, his pictures always look so stern. Oh, he wasn't that way at all. When I brought my bride to be home in the early 1940s, my wife was tall and slender, and Dad looked her over and got me aside and said, she's built for speed and light housekeeping. And I'd like to share with you his sex and hygiene lecture to me as a teenager. He got me up in the bathroom one day and closed the door, and I thought, oh boy, I'm going to find out all about it now. And he said to me, flies spread disease, keep yours buttoned. Yeah, Dr. Bob was a man of few words, but very meaningful words. He was a tall, thin Vermonter and had icy blue eyes, the kind that could look right through you. Graduate of Dartmouth, one of the Ivy League colleges, at that time the Drinkers Ivy League College, and he fit right in there. And he went out and worked in industry for a couple of years and then came back to St. Johnsbury, Vermont, his home, and prevailed upon his dad, who was a probate judge there, to allow him to come out to Chicago and go to medical school. Well, his drinking was progressive, like it always is, you know, and he got kicked out of one, managed to go to the second one, and somehow managed to graduate and obtained a coveted internship there at City Hospital in Akron. And it was coveted because they had some advanced equipment. So he moved to Akron, Ohio, and married my mom after a whirlwind courtship of only 17 years. Dr. Bob thought things over very carefully. He was the best sport in the world. You remember, this guy was a dignified surgeon, and Dr. Bob had tattoos. Yeah. One he had was a dragon on his left arm, and it started his shoulder and went round and round and out at his wrist, and it was blue with red fire. And I said, Dad, how in the world did you ever get that? And he said, boy, that was a dandy. He wanted to go back to his beloved New England one summer, and he had some kind of an old car that didn't run very well and used a lot of gasoline, and I had a Ford Roadster that I had just bought for less than $30. And he said, do you think that old Ford will make it to Vermont and then up into Canada? And I said, yeah, Dad, it runs pretty good. I said, but the reason it was so cheap, I didn't get the top. I said, what are we going to do when it rains? He said, we're going to get wet. You know, Bill was also a tall, thin Vermonter. They were born within 100 miles of each other. And to see what had happened was my mom had invited Bill, as a result of that first meeting, to come and live with us. And I think that this is one of the little miracles that happened. Mom didn't say, now, Bill, why don't you come over next Tuesday? We're going to have soup. She said, Bill, come live with us. Maybe you two can work out a program and keep us sober. And that's a little miracle. And I'll tell you something else. Remember, Bill lived in New York City and we lived in Akron, Ohio. Bill said, okay, moved in with us. Mom wrote to Lois, Bill's wife, and our beloved Al-Anon co-founder. And Lois came down and visited with us as long as she could that summer. But then she had to get back to New York City. You got to remember, Lois is the only one that had a job. But it was the start of a friendship that we kept alive until Lois's death in the not-too-distant past. Bill was the absolute opposite of my dad. Bill was garrulous. Bill was a visitor. Bill was a promoter. Bill was a visionary. I think Bill Wilson could see further up the road than any human I've ever known. Bill's mood swung. He was either high as a Georgia pine or low as a snake. He never seemed to level out. But these two guys fit together perfectly. Total opposites, but fit together perfectly. And again, I think it was providentially arranged. Because, you know, folks, if any two of us are exactly alike, one of us is unnecessary. Now, remember, they couldn't have raised $50 between them. But they both had two things going for them that I could see. And I was a teenager at the time. I thought I'd better tell you that, so I kind of knew what was going on. They had two things going for them. They both had open spiritual minds, and they had the desire to be of service to another human being. And the first one I remember was a young guy by the name of Eddie R. Eddie had just been thrown out of his house for non-payment of rent, along with a cute little blonde wife and two stair-step kids. So they moved the whole family into our house. Took Eddie upstairs and locked him in the upstairs, where he'd be available as they got this knowledge. Hey, you got to remember, they're just trying to stay a page ahead of Eddie. Nothing's written. But Eddie was an agile guy. And we had downspouts, and Eddie would open the second-story window, slide down the downspouts, and escape. And they had to recapture Eddie to continue his improvement. And one time, Eddie got as far away as Cleveland, Ohio, 35 miles, and called him up on the phone, you know, collect, of course, to let them know that he was going to commit suicide. But that he would give them time to drive up and witness the event. Well, they brought Eddie back one more time, and when Eddie sobered up, he had some other things that hadn't shown up. He began beating up on this little woman to whom he was married, and then he began chasing my mom around the house with a butcher knife. So we held a group conscience meeting. It was decided the only thing to do with Eddie was for his little wife to take him back to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and recommit him in a mental institution. And this was done, and Bill and Dad were crestfallen. Here's their first attempt to sober up another alcoholic together. Total failure. But I want to tell you folks something. At my dad's funeral, 15 years later, a guy walked up to me, and he said, "Do you know me?" And I looked over, and I said, "Yeah, I know you. You're Eddie." And he said, "That's right." And he said, "I want you to know I'm a member of the Youngstown, Ohio AA group, and I've been sober 1 year." So we don't have to be perfectly equipped to make a 12-step call. We're not responsible for the results, right? Our part is to take the hand that reaches out for help. That's our part of it. And I think the results may depend on the zeal of the person receiving the message and the will of our Heavenly Father. But our part is to take that hand that reaches out for help. Well, at first, it was just a trickle. We were taking these wet drunks into our house. See, hospital beds were very expensive in those days. A double was like $16. I think they're up a little now, but nobody had any money. So we began taking them into the house, and my dad, being the only medical man associated with this fledgling movement, would take a new guy upstairs and say, "Okay, fella, I'm going to give you a shot of whiskey, but I want you to take this medicine first." And the medicine was peraldehyde. Yeah, some of you long-timers have smelled peraldehyde. It's a very, very pungent sedative. And my sister and I, when we opened the front door coming home from school, if we smelt peraldehyde, we knew we'd lost our bed. But we didn't mind. This was recovery. This was so much better. Then after the guy, he knocked him out from 24 to 36 hours. He really gave him a jolt. And when the guy came to, they brought him downstairs to start the food, you know, to get the nerves settled down and the mind going, a little health food back into him. And they had a standard diet. It was canned tomatoes, sauerkraut. Yeah, Bill had an ulcer, and he thought sauerkraut cured everything. And Cairo syrup. I think you'll agree the early alcoholics were a hardy group. I'd like to mention just briefly, how many of you, like me, were raised in a home with active alcoholism? Would you raise your hand? Oh, wow. Let me touch on that just a little bit. My first 17 years of my life was raised in that condition, so I kind of know where you are. But for me, and I speak only for myself, the thing that I must avoid in later life is not adopting a victim mindset. Say, all the screw ups I did, all the things I was supposed to do and didn't do, they're not my fault. I'm a victim. I'm a victim, and this works. But there's a price to pay for that, and it's right up front where you can see it. The price that you must pay, that I must pay to keep that mindset is I must increasingly resent a person or a group of people, a place, or some situation. Increasingly strongly resent them. And we all know that that's the one thing that'll totally destroy us is resentment. And while we are doing it, we're giving control to that person, place, or thing. We're giving them our control. So our programs teach us how to be a survivor. I'm sure we get here with scars, but our programs teach us how to be a survivor. We're not victims, we're survivors. Well, where did they get the ideas for these things? Both Dad and Mom in Akron, Ohio for 2.5 years, and Bill in New York City had belonged to an organization called the Oxford Group. Now, the Oxford Group was started by a Lutheran minister from Pennsylvania by the name of Frank Buckman. And the basic principles of the Oxford Group were back to first century spirituality. Also, the Oxford Group had meetings. They shared with each other. They talked about their problems. They did a lot of things that had been woven into our program. They had 4 absolutes: absolute honesty, absolute unselfishness, absolute purity of thought, and absolute love. And these things have been woven into our program. And I used to go to some of those meetings with my dad and mom. But these folks were such zealots, they scared me to death. In your face, are you maximum today? And I was just barely minimum. But anyway, we owe those people a tremendous debt of gratitude, but it was inevitable that we part ways. And I'll tell you some of the things that made it necessary. The Oxford Group catered to the upper middle class, and the early alcoholics were not upper middle class. And the Oxford Group wanted publicity, and the alcoholics already had all the publicity they wanted. And the Oxford Group had a form of fifth step, but they would take a new guy upstairs in the bedroom and bore in on him till he admitted what his problem was. And, of course, that's open confession, and it is not acceptable to people of the Catholic faith. And I don't know whether you realize it or not, but there are Catholics that drink too much. So anyway, it was essential that they part ways, but we do owe those people a tremendous debt of gratitude. Okay, where else did they get the info? God has his own big book, the Holy Bible. And there were certain parts of the Bible that they found very beneficial. The Sermon on the Mount, the book of James, which, as you all know, faith without works is dead, and the 13th Corinthians. Those were the 3 passages that they found very helpful, and you might, if you're not familiar with them, you might want to take your time and read them. They're not difficult. So that was basically where some of the information came from. Well, it was just a trickle until the media got a hold of it. And then the word got out that there was a doctor in Akron, Ohio, could, quote, fix drunks. And they came in on the train and on the bus, dropped off by loving relatives, dropped off by relatives who weren't so loving. And again, I think our Heavenly Father provided the right person at the right time, Sister Ignatia. Sister was the admitting nurse at a Catholic hospital there in Akron, and she and my dad prevailed upon the Mother Superior to allow them to have a room, a small room, where people could be accepted with the disease of alcoholism for the first time. And what it was a flower room, where they cut all the flowers and did the arranging for the patients, and it was just 7 cots in there. And I've often wondered what the early alcoholics thought when they came to and there's nothing around them but flowers. I bet that gave them a jolt. What while we were admitting all these people in our home, and to my sister and I, this was fun. This was recovery. You know, the guys would come in with the blank eyes, and then pretty soon you begin to see a little sparkle, and then you got a viable human being on your hands, and it was just lots of fun. Well, the one I want to talk to you about is my mom. Nobody knows much about Ann Smith, and I think maybe she wanted it that way. Mom was a graduate of Wellesley, one of the fine women's colleges back in the East, and she went there on a scholarship. Mom's great-uncle was the president of the Santa Fe Railroad, and in those days, the president of the railroad had his own private rail car and could tie onto trains wherever trains went, and it was very opulent and grand. And he liked my mom, and he would take her with him on some of these trips, so she got to see the genteel, opulent side of life. And Mom was a school teacher. She'd led a very sheltered, protected life and was very easily shocked until AA. But remember, now, this is a lady that is making the beds. This is a lady that's cooking the food. And this is a lady that's cleaning up the messes. And this is the lady that's on the telephone because we've been getting all kinds of inquiries, you know, people calling for help. And this is a lady that endured the snubs because AA was not an instant success. It was thought of as a cult and a bunch of nuts. And we even got kicked out of the Presbyterian Church on account of AA. I never heard of anybody getting kicked out of the Presbyterian Church, but we did. But she never lost faith in these two guys, what they could do. Mom was a delightful person. She took up smoking when she was 50. I said, Mom, you're not going to start smoking now, are you? And she said, well, if you wait till you're 50, I won't say anything. But it was a depression, and Mom decided to save a little money that she stopped buying the ready-mades. So she bought a Target machine where you could roll your own cigarettes. And some of you, I know, have seen a Target machine. It had a little trough where you put the papers in for the cigarettes. Then you sprinkled the tobacco in. And you took a lever, and you rolled it over and back, and you had a cigarette. Well, my sister and I thought that was a little bit beneath our dignity. We've been swiping Mom's cigarettes. And so we offered to roll her a pack. But instead of using tobacco, we used the sharpenings out of the pencil sharpener. Well, we're watching her very carefully, you know, and when Mom lit the first one, of course, the fire didn't go out. And after a couple of those, she said, you know, these aren't nearly as good as those Lucky Strikes. All the early meetings were open meetings. Mom always sat at the very back of the room by the door, greeted everyone that came in. Always wore the same old black dress. It was the only decent dress she had. But when Dad got on his feet financially, Mom had 3 new dresses. And someone said, oh, Ann, you're going to wear a new dress to the meeting tonight? And she said, oh, no. Said, I'm going to wear the old black dress. There'll be somebody come in through those doors that can't afford a new dress. And that was my mom. Beautiful, beautiful lady. And in the early part of 1936, Mom organized a program for the wives of alcoholics, where she tried to teach them patience and love and tolerance. Mom was the one that insisted that everybody that stayed there have a quiet time in the morning that they might feel near to God. That was just one of the requirements. Mom didn't live. Mom died in 1949. But what a beautiful lady this lady was. Bill Wilson said Ann Smith is the mother of AA, and I truly believe that. But Mom also, through her little group, had realized that it was an illness that affected the whole family, and she had done something about it. And about 1950, Lois and Ann B. from New York wrote to all the known AA groups to see if there might possibly be any interest in a program like our Al-Anon program today. And to her surprise, she found out that there were 64 groups already doing it. Yeah, independent thinking. Had decided it was a family illness and they were doing something about it on their own. So you see, a lot of people with independent thinking were smart enough to realize that it not only affected the alcoholic, but the loved ones and the families. My dad only lived 15 years, but in that length of time, he personally treated without charge AA and medically over 5,000 alcoholics. and his success rate was phenomenal. And one of the things he did, he would ask a newcomer, do you believe in God? And if the guy said yes, he said, get down on your knees. And he would get down on his knees with him, because this is a very spiritual program, and his success rate was absolutely phenomenal. And I attribute it to the fact that it was totally emphasized on the spiritual part of the program. In 1950 was the first international in Cleveland, Ohio. And I attended that. My dad was there. Mama died the year before. Dad was there, and he was terminally ill, dying of cancer, and he got up and gave a short talk. But this is the international where they introduced the 12 traditions. You see, I won't go into it at length, but in 42, 45, AA started to self-destruct. So it was decided something had to be done, so the 12 traditions were written, and Bill went around the country stumping for these traditions, and groups were then like they are now. They said, Bill, go on back in New York and run that like you want to. We'll run it here like we want to, and they won't pay any attention to it. So 6 guys got up, and each of them read 2 of the traditions, and they adopted them unanimously. And oh, what a blessing. That's the glue that holds us together, folks. And if you analyze those first 11 traditions, they're damage control. He plugged all the possibilities that might destroy the program. For instance, you know, the liquor industry wanted to give AA money. Yeah. You know, a drunk laying in the gutter is not very good press. But they had enough sense not to accept that money, because had they accepted money, it would imply an obligation. So that's one of the things that the tradition stopped. We're self-supporting through our own contributions. Well, Betty and I drove my beloved dad back to Vermont one more time, and he wanted to go home and see his old hometown, and I wouldn't take for the caring and sharing that we shared as we rode along in the car and sat on the bed at night. And then we brought him back to Akron, Ohio, and I had a flying job out of Dallas at the time, and I had to get back to work, and I never saw my dad alive again. Bill invited us to the second international in 1955, and this is the one where Bill turned AA over to the AAs. And this is the one where the spiritual leaders who, you know, church people who had loved AA when AA wasn't cool, got up and talked, Dr. Sam Shoemaker and Father Ed Dowling. And these talks were recorded, and they're in the book, AA Comes of Age. The chapter Religion looks at AA, if any of you are interested. But the real thing was that Bill turned AA over to the AAs because they finally realized that the founders were mortal. And then we didn't go to another one for several years. You see, Betty and I were party animals. We loved to dance and we loved to drink, and we went merrily on our way, and I sure wasn't telling anybody my father was Dr. Bob Smith. But once in a while, someone would find it out and invite us to come to a meeting, and we could go and have a good time. And as we drove home, we said, oh, good for them. They needed that. Now, all the while, alcoholism was working in my family. Betty had poured her dad in a drying out place in 1944 in Denver, and he and another guy started Alcoholics Anonymous in New Mexico. So if there was ever 2 humans that should have recognized alcoholism, it was my wife and me. But we didn't. I guess we thought we were different. I think there's some of you out there at one time entertained that notion that you were different. And we didn't just jump right into AA either. We kept trying to touch it up, change things around a little bit. And I like to illustrate it with a little story. If you'll bear with me, 2 hunters loved to hunt way up in the North Woods. And they would hire an aviation company to fly them into a lake and leave them and then pick them up a week later. So the little plane came in, and one of the hunters said, oh, we're glad to see you. We've had a wonderful hunt. We got 3 moose. The pilot said, 3 moose, you 2 guys and me, in this little airplane? He said, I don't think it'll fly. And one of the hunters said, oh, he said, guy came in with a plane exactly like yours last year. We had 3 moose. What he did was he taxied up the river and got a longer takeoff run. And he didn't have any trouble getting in the air. So the pilot thought, well, I got to try it. So he did, and the little plane gets airborne, and they start back to civilization. But the engine is working so hard, it overheats. It loses power, and way out in the middle of nowhere, they crash. And one of the hunters drags his buddy out from under the plane, and his buddy looked around and said, "Oh, where in the world are we?" The other one said, "I think we're within 100 yards of where we crashed last year." And that was us, trying the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And I know some of you have done that. Well, when it finally got bad enough, my wife went to AA. And it really was bad. I think alcoholism might be divided into three sections: fun and problems. And we were deep into the problems end of it. In fact, my mother-in-law said, "Tell her you want a divorce. That'll shock her." This is Betty's mother tells me to tell her. So I did. And it didn't shock her near as much as I thought it ought to. I was pretty disappointed in the results. Because what I didn't realize was the alcoholism had become the number one priority, and the family had moved down the line. It's just the nature of the disease. But anyhow, she went and she did it without a treatment center. She said, "I don't recommend it, but I'll tell you one thing, you sure won't forget it." And she never took another drink. Well, I got to watching her, and she was running off and leaving me. I don't know how to describe it any other way. She was working her program. She was learning new things. So it actually, as far as I was concerned, became a program of attraction. And I thought, and someone said to me, "Okay, if you want to learn something about it, why don't you join Al-Anon?" And I thought, well, I don't mind joining the auxiliary. So I got in my car and I drove 40 miles over to Gainesville, Texas. And I walk in on my first Al-Anon meeting, and I look around, and it's a room full of women. I'm the only guy. Well, I immediately got mixed emotions about Al-Anon. I like to describe mixed emotions this way. It's kind of like the feeling you get when your teenage daughter comes in at 4 a.m. with a Gideon Bible under her arm. But anyhow, I stayed. And I really laid a trip on those gals. The rock that had been holding the family together, bloody but unbowed. And they listened very patiently, and I left there knowing I'd made a wonderful impression. But these things are revealed to us as we can handle them. And I talked to Ann, one of the ladies that was there a few years later, and she said, "Oh, I remember that meeting, Bob. When you left, we held a meeting." And we said, "Boy, there's one that's not going to make it." But thank God for that group. It's still my home group, and they're still my friends. Recovery wasn't easy for us. We had a lot of anger, an awful lot of anger. And the program saved us against that because it taught us little things to say like, "I didn't know you felt that way about it," or "You may be right." It takes two to fight. And you can stop the fight by a little saying like that. Sometimes we had to get in our car and drive it off, just to remember that we were trying to recover, not to start a fight. And we had to peel away the past, and the past dies hard, but it's so essential that we learn. One of the most profound statements I've ever heard anybody in the program say was a woman from Albuquerque. And she said, "The person I was will drink again." Wow. You become the person you were before you got to AA, and that person will drink again. You become the person you were before you got to Al-Anon, and you will get sick again. So we have to constantly work, constantly try new horizons. But the benefits are so wonderful for me. So many people, I think, have just come through the gates of hell, like we all have. And we look over at the side of the road and settle for their first shack at the side of the road. Tired, give out and say, "Well, it's good enough. I got here, didn't I?" Not realizing the wonderful things that wait in store for us if we will just put forth the effort to see the new vistas, to see the bright colors, to see the different life. It depends on continuing effort on our part. I want to spend just a little time talking about miracles, because I consider these programs to be absolutely miracles. I consider all of us here to be a miracle. How about this one? Money. You know, Bill and Dad were broke, and they thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had some money for this wonderful movement? We could build treatment centers, and I'm sure my dad could see himself in his white coat greeting the patients. Maybe Bill out on the streets flagging them in, you know. So they went to New York City and visited with some people with very deep pockets. And Mr. Rockefeller and his group listened very carefully and then said, no, money will ruin it. Miracle. Now think what would have happened in your mind's eye if Mr. Rockefeller and his group had dumped $1 million on 100 broke alcoholics. It's just horrible to even think about, isn't it? I bet we wouldn't be here today. Miracle. Anonymity. In the early days of these programs, there were people with huge egos. Now, I know we don't have any of that anymore, but you can't be Mr. AA or Mrs. Al-Anon if nobody knows what your name is. And another thing that has done, folks, it doesn't make any difference if you've been here 40 days or 40 years. We're all exactly the same. And isn't that the way it should be? Miracle. God, as we understood him, was incorporated into the big book to quite a loudmouth agnostic by the name of Jimmy B. from California. And sorry. Okay. And who said this God stuff will ruin it. It'll drag them out faster than we can drag them in. So to quiet Jimmy down, they put God as we understood him. And what that simple statement has done, that has allowed these programs to go all over the world, be fully accepted by people of the Eastern religions who perhaps have an entirely different concept of a higher power than perhaps you and me. Miracle. In the big book of AA, you know, when it was first printed, they couldn't give it away. It was in a bonded warehouse, and the guy wouldn't let them have any of them out unless they came with the cash. And they'd get a few out and then go sell them, and then they'd get a few more. And very, very slow. And now what? I hear that it's the second bestseller of all times. And also, as far as I know, you can't buy one in a bookstore. A miracle. And somehow, in those first 164 pages, they plugged all the loopholes. Now think of the millions of alcoholics that have tried to find a loophole in those first 164 pages. Somehow they managed to plug them all. And even though we're into the fourth edition, really there's only one change in that text since the first edition. And that was Bill had had a spiritual experience. It came on him boom, like a huge light. Most of us, I don't think, get it that way. With us, it's a gradual, hard work deal. So they changed the one word to having had a spiritual experience to having had a spiritual what? Awakening. And that's the only change in the text. Now, isn't that a miracle? I know it's in my heart that there are some of you here whose life is the pits, and it's starting from nothing. Well, remember that these programs started from absolutely nothing, and I think all the time with the help of a living God. And I think that there are some of you here that are absolutely in need of a miracle. Most of us here are absolute miracles, and we love to talk to you. We love to visit with you. We love to have you as part of our lives. You don't bother us, you help us. You actually help us. Every time you come to us with a question or ask for some help, you strengthen us. And you make us happy. You increase our happiness. I like to quote Dr. Albert Schweitzer, who was a humanist in my generation. Dr. Schweitzer was a world-class organist who went back to school and became a MD and then went down in the darkest Africa and started hospitals and did nothing but that the rest of his life. And Dr. Schweitzer said, I know not what your destiny may be, but this one thing I do know, that those among you who will find true happiness are those who have sought and found how to serve. So isn't that the source of our happiness, when we seek and find how to serve? So if you're new here and in bad need of a miracle, talk to us. You don't bother us, you make us happy. And, you know, our theme is happy, joyous, and free. So if you're a little bit bashful, talk to us. Talk to us, will you? Make us happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
This is a